Brought to you by Pearshell Financial Group.
When you've got questions, he always has an answer. It's Sean Hannity this afternoon at 2, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Carol Roth is in for Amy J this morning. And this race for the Democrat Socialist nomination for president is really up for grabs now that Michael Avenatti is out of the way.
Yes, which is unfortunate. He's actually trying to plot a comeback as we speak.
CNN will be there with him when he's exonerated. Also, some devastating news. I don't know how to break this to you, but on the latest edition of the Delaware Hillbillies, Hunter Biden has broken up with his deceased brother's widow, Haley. They're no longer a thing.
I think you need to walk through that because a deceased brother's widow is hard to process. Do you want to walk through the wonderful soap opera story that we've got going on?
Well,
there?
remember, Beau Biden died from brain cancer in 2015. That was terrible. And apparently his wife, Haley, and Hunter had been having a relationship prior to his death, which I believe is still problematic for some, though I don't know. And that sort of incestuousness, perhaps a bit off-putting, but I guess when
love is love.
Well, and then when the patriarch is Creepshow Joe, I mean, you know.
But I would imagine that this makes the holidays now even more awkward. If it weren't awkward enough that all of a sudden that your dead family member's brother was now having a relationship with his former wife. Now that has broken up, so I would imagine that adds an extra layer of awkwardness to pass the potatoes.
Well, and Hunter Biden, yes. He was apparently dating Haley. Also, he was married to his wife, Kathleen, at the time. In the D.C. divorce filing, Kathleen Biden cited irreconcilable differences to how Hunter spent their money, quote, extravagantly on his own interests, including drugs, alcohol, prostitutes, strip clubs, and gifts for women with whom he has sexual relations, while leaving the family with no funds to pay legitimate bills.
I would say that seems like some irreconcilable differences in my mind.
Yeah, now, again, I mean, Joe can only provide
he can
an
only
example
carry
to the
so much
kids.
of the water by himself, right?
So much. But getting back to politics, too, the big headline for Creepshow Joe yesterday was surging ahead, got a 25-point lead in the national polling on his next closest rival, Bolshevik Bernie. Before everybody who's not incontinent wets themselves over Biden's surging, April of 2015?
Yeah.
Jeb Bush surged to the lead at
in a very low energy way. It was a very low energy surge, a surge nonetheless.
It was a gate. It was a leisurely gate to the head of the pack. 22% Jeb Bush had. Donald Trump had 1%. And it's not just that Donald Trump made up the difference and made it up quickly. Jeb never really even competed for a victory anywhere. But it was also who was at the top and then how that flipped to Trump and Cruz and Kasich at the end.
Well, go back to Barack Obama. I mean, nobody saw that coming early on either.
Right. So, I mean, but I mean, crowded field to crowded field, 2016 Republicans to 2020
right. There's
Democrats.
There's more of an apples to apples there.
Yeah. And so I just, the idea that Biden really represents the center of the Democratic Party, that's the majority. First of all, how far has the center moved left? Because Joe Biden is no moderate, number one. Number two is, no, he doesn't. And he's about to find out, I think, but maybe I'm wrong. It happens from time to time. Let me check myself against an expert. And we're pleased to be joined by Ed Morrissey, who is such a person, senior editor for hotair.com, columnist for the week. Ed, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
So is Creepshow Joe, despite the Neil Kinnock endorsement, which is huge, is he a flash in the pan? Is he going to be flailing by the end of the summer, or do you think he has staying power?
First off, kudos to the Neil Kinnock reference there.
Thank you very much.
I'm old enough to get that one, Dan, and I know that you're not. So you had to be doing your research to make sure that you came up with that one. Look, I think that Joe Biden is a front runner mostly because of name recognition. I don't think that he's a very good campaigner, and I think he's 30 years ago and 12 years ago he proved that. And I think that when it comes down to it, you're right. He doesn't represent where the Democratic Party is today. And I think he represents almost the antithesis of where the Democratic Party is today. For better or worse, I don't think anybody can dispute that. And that's part of what the Democratic Party's problem is here, is that they've got two guys at the top who really don't represent where their party is going, and they've got a whole bunch of people in that race that do represent where their party is going, but they can't get above 10% in most of these polls.
So when you say where the party is going, is that a policy standpoint? Is that a diversity and inclusion standpoint? Where do you think the Democratic Party stands now?
Well, I think that the diversity and inclusion part of that is their policy. I literally think that's policy for them. It is their primary policy. It is far beyond anything else that they're proposing, whether it be, some sort of welfare restructuring or Medicare for all or anything else like that. I think that just the diversity and inclusion issue alone is their primary agenda item. And so if that's the case, and I truly believe that that's the case, then how can you have Joe Biden at the top of a ticket?
Closely followed behind that as their top priority is impeaching Trump and confirming their preordained conclusion that he is an agent of Vlad Putin. And so they were in full conniption fit yesterday when the story broke that Bob Mueller wrote a letter to William Barr saying, hey, I didn't really like your characterization, your summary of my report. It lacked a proper accounting for the nuance in the report on the obstruction issue, despite the fact that the full report was released a few days later. So what's the big deal? But anyway, they think that this is grounds to impeach not only Trump, but Barr now, too. It's impeach everybody. Is the best thing that could happen to Trump for Democrat socialists to find a way to do what their committee chairmen want them to do, which is move to impeach?
Yes. I think the short answer to that is yes, because I think that had the Russia collusion hypothesis borne out in the Mueller report, I think there would have been a groundswell for impeachment among the voters. The problem for House Democrats, especially House Democrats, I would say, is that they sold impeachment on the basis of that. You have Adam Schiff going out there and saying, I've got evidence that Donald Trump is a Russian agent. I've got all the evidence of collusion I need. And so far he hasn't released any of it because Bob Mueller couldn't find any. And having raised those expectations and then having Robert Mueller come back and say, well, there's no evidence of that, they've lost the thread on impeachment. And so if they continue to press it, it's going to not look like they're trying to safeguard American democracy. It's going to look like they're trying to overthrow a legitimate election. And I think that they're going to pay a heavy price at the ballot box in 2020 if they pursue that. And I think you have people like Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer who were around 21 years ago when Republicans tried to do the same thing, realizing that this is a huge mistake, and they're trying to step on the brakes today. The Hill's Alexander Bolton is reporting that Senate Democrats are trying to step on the brakes too, trying to tell them don't push this. And I don't know if they're listening, but at least so far the evidence is they're not.
So when you look at the items that are a big deal with voters today, healthcare persistently is at the top of the polls. Obviously, the economy is doing well. If it holds up, that's a good thing for Trump. But do you think the fact that the Republicans have not done anything in terms of coming up with even the semblance, the sketches of a potential health care plan that could potentially pass, do you think that ends up being an albatross for Trump?
I don't think that the health care issue will be as much of an albatross as if they don't concentrate on the economy the next time around. The problem, I think, in 2018, was that rather than focus on all the great things that were happening in the economy, they suddenly made immigration and the crisis the centerpiece of that midterm election, and I think that ended up being a loser for them. I think that it rather than focus on the stuff that they had been doing that was working, that was great. In fact, that was really one of the few things that they got done. They basically were running and saying, we didn't get anything done on this yet. We didn't get anything done on this yet. At least that's the way it came across. And I think that it's sort of unleashed the type of rhetoric that puts off people in suburban districts. And that's the reason why you saw this sort of retrenchment. And I think the Brett Kavanaugh thing probably saved them from an even deeper loss in the midterms on that basis. If they don't come back around and start talking about the economy in 2020, and if they start doing this crisis sort of thing again, I think voters can reasonably say, well, then what did we elect you for? Maybe we should change horses at this point in time. They're going to have to come up with a better message.
Well, no, I certainly don't disagree about talking about the economy's growth and the job creation. But do you think the immigration issue has matured more than it had by the time of November of 2018, where you have a majority of the country and even a lot of Democrats conceding at least that there's a humanitarian crisis at the border, and thus there is an issue that needs to be addressed? And on the one hand, you have President Trump, who's serious about border security, but is also offered compromises that are pretty middle of the road, like the pathway to citizenship or permanent status for 1.8 million Dreamers and those who could have had Dreamer designation. And Beto O'Rourke wants to tear down the walls that are already up in El Paso, and the others, so many of the others, are open borders types. And do you want that regime, or do you want some sort of middle way that I've proposed to address this crisis that I think more people are tuning into?
You know, here's what I think about immigration, is I think that both parties use it to stoke their bases, and even though they may both be talking about, and they are both talking about compromises, neither one really means it. And both sides use inflammatory rhetoric in order to propose maximalist positions, and they sell their bases on it. And it's true of Republicans as much as it's true of Democrats. And I think that people are tired of that, and so even though there is a crisis, I think it's a bit of the boy who cried wolf at this point in time. I think people are just kind of resigned to it, that this is always going to be a crisis. And so I think that if you look at the results of using that messaging in 2018, may have seen the limits of how effective that can be for Republicans, and possibly even for Democrats too, because Democrats weren't running on immigration; they were running on health care, and it resonated.
I want to. Brad Parscale, who's Trump's campaign manager, was on the Sunday Talkies this weekend. Face the Nation talked about the 2020 campaign being bigger, badder, and better than 2016. There's been a lot of ink devoted to chaos and the way Trump manages the Oval Office. Where do you get the senses in terms of organization of the Trump campaign and the Republican Party as we're 18 months out from the election? We haven't talked to, and not very few people have talked about that.
I don't really have too much of a sense of it. I would suspect that the organization in the Trump campaign is probably pretty good. They were actually pretty good. I mean, they did things differently in the 2016 cycle than most traditional campaigns would do, but they were organized pretty well, and at least internally they were organized pretty well. I think they're going to have to do a better job of organizing on the ground among voters. They're going to have to do a lot better this time around, because they're probably not going to run into a campaign like Hillary Clinton's again, which was just a terribly designed campaign. And I would at least suspect that Democrats learned a lesson from that and are going to be looking to do something quite a bit different in 2020.
What about in terms of the House and the Senate races? Do you think that they have enough focus on what's going on there? Because that's another thing that doesn't seem like there's quite as much attention on as perhaps should be at this point.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think what the risk that you're running here is that this sort of incorporation of the RNC into the Trump campaign is going to create a lower focus on the House and Senate, and for that matter, the state level campaigns. Now, the constituent Republican parties of the RNC are supposed to focus on the state and local elections, but they send a lot of resources up to the national organization, and they expect to get a lot of organization on the ground, which supports all of these things. And if the RNC is more attuned to whatever the Trump campaign's priorities are, it's a really good possibility that the organization on the ground is going to suffer. as a result in those other races. And so that's something that we really want to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
He is Ed Morrissey, senior editor for hotair.com and columnist for The Week. Ed, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Great to be on with you.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/